Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Accounting Profits and Prosperity Show. I am your host, Louis Prosperi. I am very happy to have on our show Sally Helgesen. We are going to talk about her brand new book, Rising Together, How We Can Bridge Divides and Create More Inclusive Workplaces. I think this is a great book for the modern professional firm and their need to retain and build positive teams. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Louis. Good to be here.
I'm very excited today with regards to talking about your brand new book called Rising Together, How We Can Bridge Divides and Create a More Inclusive Workplace. I spent last weekend reading it and I found it extremely interesting and I was quite impressed with it, to be quite honest. So what I'd like to start right off on is you've separated it into two components. And the part that I'm interested in right now is the trigger part. You said there's 8 common triggers. Could you elaborate to what those 8 are?
Sure. 8 common triggers, and these are emotional responses we have to situations that are particularly related to being able to deal effectively and well with people we may perceive as different from ourselves at work. So that's the specific context in which I'm using triggers in the book, Rising Together. So a couple of them are visibility, communications, networking, how we build our alliances, managing perceptions. A big one is fairness. It's not fair. Humor is also very active and very alive. Attraction, a few others like that. But I would say fairness, visibility, how we build networks, and communications are the triggers that are most likely to cause issues and to perhaps encourage us to get dug in on why these are someone else's fault.
Let's premise this first, because in your book, you premise 2 components, right? Like these are triggers which are not necessarily what we would call abusive behavior or things that you should, complain or not tolerate. These are triggers that are related to that technically you should be able to manage and improve how you react in the environment. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. These are not meant to address the way I talk about the techniques for addressing triggers are not meant to be used in cases of sexual harassment, of racist behavior or conversation. Not at all. Those require serious redress. These are more the everyday triggers that can set us off. It's not fair. They're only promoting men around here. They're only promoting women around here, etc. How do we deal with those?
So let's talk about the one that I highlighted here was visibility, because that one to me is, like you said, no one's recognizing my work or and sometimes that's not accurate in the sense of how we perceive it, right? Perception is what we perceive and what other people perceive. The ones that I've noticed in your book was work that goes unnoticed, which is an interesting one. Resentment to those who do get noticed from the others. And you devalue one's value because they got noticed or they're less qualified. Can you go through those 3? Because those ones happen every day. I've been on the management side, and when people decide to leave, usually it's one of these things that bothers them the most, or it could be a trigger for people leaving the firm.
Exactly. Either I feel triggered because I'm not getting noticed. I do the work, but I'm not a showboat. Other people are showboats. Other people are willing to talk all the time about their work, and I'm not, and therefore I'm a better person than those people. So I feel resentful that I do all the work and don't get noticed. Or we can be, if we're very good at compelling notice, then it can happen that we feel triggered by people who aren't. Well, if she sits in the back of the room all the time, doesn't speak up, there's nothing I can do about it. I can't help. It must mean she's not a player, something like that. We'll have comforting stories we tell ourselves about why what we're doing is perfectly fine. Other people aren't getting it, aren't noticing. And this may be true, but it doesn't matter because our being triggered by it and the stories, especially the stories, the narratives we tell ourselves about it, that's what keeps us stuck.
Right. So I guess step 1 is noticing that if you're in any of those 3 categories we just talked about, and it was interesting you brought up the other one where someone who always gets noticed devalues the other person, which is also a trigger in a negative way. Great way for, I guess, as a leader who is an outgoing person and devalues the ones that don't make an effort. right? How do we then take this trigger and identify it? And then what can we do, or examples of what we can do to diffuse it so that we can be more functional? Because once you hit one of these triggers, I like how you said stuck, then it impacts our performance, our ability, and eventually it either reacts to where the teammates and our manager feels that our work is suffering, or we end up now disengaging, right? So how can we deal with it? Like, what are the things that we could utilize internally to not get unstuck?
Excellent. I'm glad you used the word disengagement, because that's what I see. When you don't feel your work is recognized or valued, over time, you will disengage,
Yeah.
because it's hard to remain engaged if you feel chronically undervalued. So it's very important to address this trigger of visibility, especially if you feel that your work does not get recognized. The most important thing is to get out of this narrative that the people who are compelling notice are showboats, or that you're in some way a better person than they are. Say you go into a meeting and you make this a very common situation with women, where you'll go into a meeting and you make an observation or comment or a suggestion and nobody picks up on it. A couple of minutes later, a man or someone in a much more senior position will make virtually the same observation, and everybody says, oh, what a great idea, or let's go with that, or whatever it is. So the typical way, so that's a moment when your visibility trigger is really activated. And what we often will do in that situation, we feel like, well, I don't want to say anything in front of everybody. That would be embarrassing. We know that being defensive or saying, well, I had that idea first, is never going to work. So what we do is we either just feel bad about it and, these people don't get it, whatever it is, or we will try to use it to bond with other people, other women, so you're going out of the room and you'll say, they never listen to us, something like that. Yeah. So the problem with this is, even if it's true, and it's not always true because you don't know what just happened there, even if it's true, it doesn't give us a path forward. So what we want to do is get curious and test it out a little. What could be another explanation for that? Maybe the guy who repeated our idea isn't trying to poach it or get credit for it. Maybe he hadn't heard it and it occurred to him. Or maybe he thought that the way we had phrased it didn't really get heard by other people, so he was repeating it. Whatever kind of story or narrative we can come up with that can give us a positive path forward, that can provide a path to action, is going to serve us better than letting that trigger that emotional response we have to feeling unheard and disrespected. That's not going to serve us. So if we come up with this alternate story, even if we don't necessarily believe it's true, then we can have a path to action. Then we can go up to that person afterwards and say, it's interesting you made the same point that I did. I'm glad we're in agreement. Maybe we could schedule a little time to discuss taking this forward. So what have you done then? You've gotten rid of that terrible feeling on one hand. You've potentially begun to enlist that person as an ally rather than just an enemy or someone who disrespects you. So there are all kinds of ways you can move forward with that kind of narrative. Very positive approach, which we often don't take because we're afraid that we're getting stepped on or that we'll be acting fake if we don't necessarily believe that narrative.
When you were doing the explanation, that makes sense because we don't really know what the other people are actually thinking because we're not in their heads. When we get a trigger, it's a negative response, right? We assume the worst. What you're really saying then is take a step back and look at the positive. So give them the benefit of the doubt that they weren't being malice in their intent. I really like that. That kind of diffuses the trigger internally because then you don't feel as bad because now what you're doing is saying, well, they didn't hear it or they were trying to support me. When you feel that someone's supporting you, even though it's still a trigger that you didn't get heard by the whole team, you don't feel the same thing. That's putting a twist on a trigger, right? I like that benefit of the doubt. I really like that.
I like that idea of a twist on a trigger. It really is a powerful way of doing it. We're giving the other person, to some degree, the benefit of our goodwill, which feels
Yeah.
good to us to do that. But also, there's an element, the model I always use, and I use this in my coaching, is that we have an awareness of what just happened. So we're not repressing it. We're not pretending we're bigger than that and not noticing. We have an awareness. Then we have an acceptance. Look, this is what happened. People heard him say it. Apparently, they didn't seem to see me say it. So I accept that. And then we have an action. So that's a 3-step sort of process that can make us feel better and be much more effective.
I think that's great. The other thing that keep through your example really resonated is it's easy to give up or it's easy to stay stuck, right? The tough part is when you're suggesting someone after a meeting who was shot down or was not heard and then going to the person who basically took your idea and maybe said it a little differently and collaborating, that's really going on. There's a vulnerability component that you have to express, which I thought was unique, that we have to show vulnerability to move on. And like I said, very intuitive. I was quite impressed with that. That was fantastic. Let's go to the other trigger that I thought, which is perceptions. And I think this is more related to basically the male, female, or minority thing, is because ambition is a good one when ambition is perceived differently depending on who it is. If you could go a little bit more into that detail, because that actually has a big impact, particularly women in the workforce, when they're trying to perceive ambition and sometimes it doesn't come across properly. I guess I don't know how else to say it.
It's that women are often fearful that if they speak up or speak in a situation where they haven't necessarily been asked to, that they'll be perceived of as too ambitious or overly ambitious. We've seen how this works. We see it with female politicians all the time. Oh, she's so ambitious. Yeah. She's running for senator. Of course she's ambitious. Everyone running for senator is ambitious.
Sure. Yes.
So this becomes a kind of common meme. And the issue is that this will make often women, for example, here, reluctant to act in a way that really serves their interest because they're worried. They're trying to manage the perception of people not thinking they're ambitious. I will tell you, one of the most common questions I get when I do women's leadership workshop is the following. How can I talk about my contributions without anybody ever thinking that I'm overly aggressive or too assertive or too ambitious? That is a question related to managing perceptions. Your job in that moment is to represent what your contributions are. And if someone happens to think, oh, well, she's pretty ambitious or whatever that is, that's their problem. So it doesn't do to get too invested in always trying to manage other people's perceptions or prevent them from ever thinking that you are too whatever. Maybe you remind them of their wife. Maybe you remind them of their ex-wife. Maybe you remind them of, some aspect of their daughter that they're trying to work with her on. You do not know. So for women, I think being able to let go of some of that need, that feeling that they need to manage people's perceptions is really valuable. This also applies to men who are in the minority. For example, in the United States, male African Americans have reported to me for years that they'll just say something like, well, I don't agree with that. And somebody will say, boy, I think you feel angry. So they have to deal with that.
Right.
Anybody who is outside of the standard leadership mainstream or the historic leadership mainstream often has to find themselves in a position of managing perceptions. On the other hand, many in our culture, white men, I do a lot of work in Asia, so I never like to use the phrase white men because guess what? In Japan, it's not white men, but it often undermanage perceptions, and that is they'll walk in with a clueless obliviousness to whoever is in their audience and just say whatever it is they have to say while under managing perception. So we want to find that sweet spot.
So here's one of the things that I would like you to discuss further. You also quoted Michelle Obama, where dealing with perceptions was when they go low, you go high, which was a really good one. And the story about Fred, your boss's boss, and how that worked out, because that story actually resonates exactly what you're saying, is that you can't necessarily change someone's perception, but you can influence their perception over time as long as you take a certain positive approach. And if you go through that, I would love you to sort of tell our audience a little bit about that story, if you don't mind.
Certainly. That was a story that I learned a lot from. So this is years ago, and I was working in corporate communications, and I was in a meeting where I was both the youngest person and the only woman. And they were talking about something, an idea, a project that they wanted to do. And I had what I thought was a really good idea about it. Subsequently proved to be, although I wasn't the one who was able to put it forward. And I mentioned this idea. I said, I think it would also be interesting if we tried, and then shared that idea. And nobody responded. It was as if I hadn't spoken.
Right.
And I wasn't that surprised because of my extreme junior status in that meeting. And then afterwards, as everybody was walking out, my boss's boss, this is this guy, Fred, came up behind me and said in the most scathing tone you can imagine, "Well, I guess you don't have any trouble sharing your opinion," as if I was certainly the last person who should have spoken up. Now, I don't know what got into my, at that time, I think 35-year-old self. But rather than saying, "No, I don't," in a defensive way, or "I have every right to say what I think," or saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't have spoken up, I'm a nice girl," whatever. I just said, very simply, came out of my mouth, "No, I'm not," which I'm not. He walked off, just like, "Oh, woof." Really, just don't making those kinds of noises. So I said, okay, I am dead in the water at this company. My boss's boss thinks, I'm this over aggressive person who speaks out of turn, but nothing really happened. And it was about 2 months later, maybe less than that, I overheard him in an office that I was passing where the door was open, speaking to a colleague in my department. And what he was saying was, "What I like about Sally is she's not afraid to say what she thinks." I could not have been more surprised. But what I learned from that is if you don't rush in and, as we're talking about, try to manage someone's perceptions, if you don't do that, if you decline to do that and say, "No, I'm not," as I did, then they have a chance to come around. They may change their mind. I'm not saying they will change their mind, but they may change their mind over time. We all know how that works. We've all thought, "I can't stand that person." And then we get to know them a little bit and we find we actually really like them. So that's part of the problem with managing perceptions. We race in and we short circuit what could be the development of a relationship or a perception over time by trying to overmanage it.
So that's why I love that story, was that it's not a given that the perception is constant and forever. But you're right. If you reinforce the perception of that person, then it becomes concrete. Again, it doesn't mean that you will change it, but there's an opportunity for it. And I love that. So if you, again, the positive approach, take a negative trigger and give the benefit of the doubt, which you did, even though internally you said, "That's it, I'm done here," but you didn't express that externally. And so and behold, things were actually different because you cannot read everybody's mind. And there's another story. I know we're spending a little bit of time on perception, but I really love this because this happens a lot between men and women in a lot of situations. And this one was Arthur, the leader, speaking in a predominantly all-female audience. And this is something that happens quite readily with leaders, male leaders that are used to addressing men or predominantly male audiences, and all of a sudden now they go into a female thing where perception is a two-way street. And this one here really was interesting, and I'm going to ask you to do a better job than I'm doing right now, but was where he's making a change thinking that it would be better suited, and in fact it hurt in the end how people perceived them. Please go through that one, because that one was I really love that story. That happens a lot more than people think.
Oh,
You know?
yeah, it definitely does. Because I do a lot of conferences, so I see a lot of men speaking to women's audiences, and I
Right.
see the ways it can go haywire when they're trying to either manage perceptions or just going into it cluelessly. In that example, which was Arthur, who was a healthcare CEO, and he was actually known as a great champion of women, and he
Right.
was a wonderful leader. And I happened to be in the audience when he was giving an address about his own leadership style and how that had developed to a large group of people who were fairly senior in the healthcare field. We know the composition of healthcare, so you'd think that there would be a good number of women there. But
Right.
Arthur didn't seem to think that that was going to happen because he knew it was executives. So he showed up at this conference, and I talked to his chief of staff later, and he had prepared what looked like a very interesting talk on his personal journey as a leader and what he had learned. But when he stood up there and he saw that he had about an 80% female audience, he apparently got scared that this was not going to resonate, that his leadership journey, what he had learned about leadership as a leader over his 40 years in the sector, was not going to somehow be relevant to women. So what he did, and I've seen this happen, what he did was he made a decision to kind of put that aside. He said, I'm going to put this aside and I'm going to talk from the heart. And he spent almost his entire 30-minute speech talking about his wife, how wonderful she was, how brilliant she was, how she could probably do his job better than he could, but she had made the choice to stay home with their children, and how he always asked her advice, and blah, 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 blah. So I'm thinking, wow, this is really not working. But this was my perception, so I decided afterwards to conduct some sort of informal polling of the women who were present, because I knew quite a number of them, and they were really turned off by what Arthur did. And they got comments like, has he never addressed a group of women before? That's what it seemed like. I heard comments like, he apparently doesn't think women have any interest at all in leadership. Why is he so condescending to his wife? They said that because he was singing her praises in a way that sounded sort of unrealistic. But
Right.
the other one, the one that really got me, was when a number of women said, that crack he made about, my wife made the decision to stay home. Is he suggesting that because we're at this conference and we hold senior jobs, that we are not as good mother as his wife? So he managed to offend the women in that audience on so many different levels. And it was also funny because there were a couple of the guys that I knew. I went up and said, how did that speech land to you? And they said, well, I don't know. It was kind of confusing, but I bet the women loved it. All that stuff about his wife. It was amusing to me. So on one hand, he was undermanaging the perceptions of the people in the audience by trying to make guesses at what they would like. But on the other hand, he was really over-managing it by throwing out a perfectly good talk that he had prepared, based on the assumption that this would not be of interest to women, and he fell down on all points. I have watched this happen over and over. I've watched the cluelessness. I have watched men, and I'm talking about in the last 10 years, tell jokes that are so inappropriate for a female audience. Either they're off color to some degree, and the women are like, are you kidding me? Or they're just like an endless stream of golf jokes that for many women are completely without resonance, or, sort of inside baseball stuff. So I've watched men do that. And then I have also seen, although not as egregiously as Arthur, men go in the other direction, and it does not work. It comes across as pandering and cluelessness.
It's the person who wants to do good ends up shooting himself in the foot. And it's all about perception, thinking that his story wouldn't resonate with women, but these are technically executives. So technically, whether it's a man or woman, the chances are his story would resonate because it's not gender specific, right? At the end of the day, some of it might be related to his gender, but the bulk of it would probably be transferable to whoever was in that position. I think I agree with that. I think the original story that he had probably would have been bang on with who he was talking to. So I love that. I know that we're running out of time, but I really want to talk about the confidence and competence trigger. And the reason why it kind of goes into the communication component, where the affirmation skit from Saturday Night Live you referenced, and for us older people, we know that one, which was, you talk into a mirror, and the difference between confidence and competence. And you've put in that thing is, if you have to pick one or the other, pick competence over confidence every time, because that's the way to go. If you could explain that and then go right into communication trigger, that would be fantastic.
Certainly. Well, the confidence and competence, women are always getting the idea that they lack this sort of total confidence in their own ability, and that undermines them in some way. And it's partly because we don't understand the difference between confidence and overcompetence. But research shows that the number one factor that affects your success, especially in a senior position, is actually your competence, and that working to develop your own competence, and this goes back to the visibility and looks forward to communication, and your ability to articulate what you're competent at, the benefits of the competence that you are contributing to the organization, the impact it has on customers or clients, etc. So those two allied, that ability to articulate your competence along with the competence, that's what really makes for a successful leader. Now, we can all say we've seen leaders in very top positions who seem to demonstrably lack competence, but they have confidence in their own magical powers that are extraordinary. We see instances of this all the time, or even competence that's not transferable to another arena. I was good at that, so I'm going to be great at this, even though it's apples and oranges. And that is not confidence. That's really overconfidence. That is an unearned confidence. So part of my concern has been women are constantly being urged, just be confident, be bold, look in the mirror and say to yourself, I am wonderful, I am fabulous. Okay, if you want to, that's fine, but that's not going to help you. What's really going to help you is that development of the competence, which women tend to be very good at and very diligent. And then the other part of that is being able to articulate that, but in a realistic kind of way, and not make these off-the-wall assumptions about how terrific you are. You end up in Elizabeth Holmes territory by doing that.
And communicating it effectively. Like, that's when I saw the two, I saw, okay, so you understand your competence and be good at that, and communicating that effectively is the key. Like, to me, they go hand in hand. I think if you do both, I think the confidence kind of builds in right after that. I think confidence is an after effect, or should be an after effect of building good competence, right?
Yes, definitely. And it's why, there's concern these days with, giving kids an award just for having participated. Fine, that's fine. But it gives a message that you don't have to work to be competent. They're just showing.
You just have to show up, right? Just show up and you're good. Yeah. That's a whole different debate.
I know.
To be quite honest. We've talked a lot about triggers. I just want to briefly talk about one component about the environment, and that's the power of inclusive behavior. If you could spend a few minutes just on that and how that would be critical if you want to build the right team. And one of the things you put in there, just as a side note, is helping your team, your staff, advance their career goals, whether or not they're with your company. And I think that's kind of a missed value, because in today's world, the chances of you finding an employee that's going to be with you till they retire doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, if they're in their late 50s, maybe at that point, that might be their retirement. But if they're coming into their 20s and 30s, even in their 40s, the chances of them being there at retirement doesn't exist. But what does exist is your ability to help them go to the next level, which means you get the most out of both worlds. Can you explain that a little bit?
Oh, certainly. And I think this is an opportunity that many leaders, whether we're talking about the senior leadership of an organization or team team leaders really, really miss, and it's a very easy one. When you have a young employee, what are you interested in doing potentially in the future? It's not set in stone, things change.
Sure.
But give me a sense of where you would like your career to lead, either in this organization or if it's years down the road outside the organization. What do you see for yourself? What are you good at? That's a way of asking. What are you good at? Where does your interest lie? Another question that aligns with that is asking, for example, what skills do you have that you feel may not be getting enough exercise or development here? What skills would you like to develop? Is there a way I can be helpful to you in developing those skills? They may be skills that are very much related to the job, but asking those kinds of very specific questions and getting to know the aspirations and the skill base of younger people is so essential to giving them the feeling, the knowledge that you are really in their corner. Just saying, I'm in your corner, or, we have great opportunities here. Those kinds of generic statements don't really lead anywhere. So having those kind of conversations in a very honest way. And when you get some pushback like, well, I'm not quite sure, whatever. Well, okay, that's fine. That's fair. But what might you be interested in? Or take a moment to think about it, but come back to me because I really want to know how I can be useful to you, how I can help you develop, how I can help you contribute what you feel is a maximum that you have to contribute in this position, but also later on in your career. That's how you position yourself as an ally. A couple other things that I've heard younger people complain about. One really surprised me. Apparently, the chief complaint that younger people who have left organizations have is that my boss never took the trouble to learn my name, or this is very common, my boss never learned how to pronounce my name. There are lots of names out there in the environment. It's not, the era of Sally and Louie and Tom and Mary Sue. It is a very different world out there. And often, if we're uncomfortable pronouncing a name, we'll kind of slur it over, or we don't ask the question. It's very simple. How do I pronounce your name? Repeat it and then remember it. And if by chance you forget it once, ask again. But that's a way of really showing respect that I think that people of our age are not doing a sufficiently good job of. So it's something to really keep in mind.
That's interesting because names are my biggest Achilles heel, simply because my tongue gets tied a lot. I try constantly to remember people's names, and I have to repeat them a few times. They get flustered after a while when I butcher it for the 50th time. Sometimes they let me just use an acronym, and I'm grateful and I thank them for it. But I still try. But I get what you're saying is it's important because it's their identity. It makes perfect sense. So I get it. Well, Sally, this has been fantastic. I want to thank you. We've only touched the surface of this book, to be quite honest. I have another 20 questions really, but time's out. Is there any way for anybody that would like to get a hold of you, Sally, or find out more about you? Where would they be looking?
Oh, that's very easy question to answer. My website is sallyhelgesen.com. It has a contact button there. We're redoing the website, but we're keeping the old one up. So the contact button is lively, and you can reach me that way very easily via email. I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter, just as Sally Helgesen. So I would love to hear from anybody out there. I've really enjoyed our conversation today, Louis.
Me too. Again, thank you very much. Even though I know a lot of your talks about, or your books is about women, but from a male perspective, to be quite honest, it's universal. And I enjoyed this immensely. And when I read your book, because your books are designed for women, us guys, and I'm going to be, again, perception. right? This is a perception issue, which now I'm changing. You don't then generally go to. And because of this interview, I had to read this. Now I want to read more of these type of books because they give me a insight that I didn't have before. And I want to thank you for that on a personal level because I was really happy for it. So thanks again, Sally. I look forward to hopefully seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here.
Well, that wraps up another show. I want to thank Sally for her insight, expertise, and knowledge on this topic, and all of you for joining us today. Please subscribe to the channel and be well and stay hydrated.